Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Solid topic? Let's do it. What's the creepiest thing you've ever seen in broad daylight? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Guy was trying to start a fight with random guys while queuing up to get into a concert. He was also coming out with all this creepy shit to the girls around him. He was standing right next to me, and I was just telling him to stop acting like such a stupid see you next Tuesday when someone walked up and stabbed him in the chest. He died pretty much instantly. This was in the 1990s New Zealand. Not quite broad daylight, but more like dusk. I look out my front window, and I see a lump on my lawn that looks out of place. I think, that looks like a dude in a ghillie suit on my front lawn. I keep staring at it, and become more and more convinced it's a dude in a ghillie suit. And I start to freak out a bit, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do in this situation. Like, do I call the cops? Then a bunch of neighborhood kids run up to the lump, and the actual, factual, real dude in a ghillie suit gets up. It was an older kid or a dad or something playing hide and seek in a ghillie suit. The creepiest thing for me was when I was out surfing in Northern California. It's really cold, dark water, and I was out by myself. I was sitting there waiting for a wave, and my leash felt like it was caught up, which it does sometimes. I like to fix it before a wave comes so there's no hindrance when I go to stand up. Well, I pull at it a little bit, and it feels like seaweed or something on it. I turn towards the back of my board, and there's something on it. A harbor seal, who's sitting on the back of my board laying on my leash. Scared the out of me, but me screaming scared the out of him, and it went back into the water and I paddled in. I know it's not the creepiest thing in this thread, but it definitely scared me pretty good. I watched a murder of crows follow a Toyota Corolla into a mall parking lot. The car parked, and a greasy-looking middle-aged man got out. He beelined for the mall entrance without once making eye contact with the crows who were now following him. At the last second before entering the mall, he tossed a big handful of peanuts over his shoulders, and the crows went wild. It seemed less like the man was controlling the crows, and more like the crows were controlling him. Was taking the subway one day, and a lady was walking around chugging a massive bottle of hot sauce, bloodshot eyes, tears streaming down her face. Of course, she sat next to me on the two-seat bench. At first, she was complimenting my nails, and then she just started staring at me, much too close for comfort. She still had tears down her face, still chugging the hot sauce. I made a comment asking if it was good or something. She acted like I was crazy for noticing it. This was at least 2 years ago, and I still can't get her face out of my mind. Hope she's doing well. Driving down the 5 in California, I saw a car drift across the center divide. It's a massive highway in the middle of nowhere with a big grass divide, maybe the equivalent of 3 to 4 lanes wide, and directly into a semi-truck going the other way. I was probably 2 to 3 cars behind the drifting car. Neither vehicle had hardly any chance to brake. It happened over the course of maybe 2 seconds. It literally exploded into pulverized dust. No flames or fire, just a massive explosion of glass, metal, paint, and presumably the occupants. The semi shuddered horribly, but with its massive inertia, it seemed to lose very little forward momentum. It happened so fast, we were past it in seconds. The poor person must have fallen asleep at the wheel or something. Got lost driving through Montana, and wound up in the middle of nowhere. Saw a small town, maybe like 15 buildings total, and figured I'd ask for directions. As I got closer, I saw that it looked like it was abandoned. Houses all dilapidated and in disrepair. But every house had a shiny new car in front of it. Not sure what it was about, but my girlfriend and I both got real bad vibes from it and just drove right past. I was like 10 and kept hearing a thumping noise from our garage. Thought it was an animal or something. I found my bio mom covered in blood and convulsing from an OD, and she had fell and cut her stomach open somehow. It was truly like a movie. The light was shining on through the windows on the garage door and illuminating just her. She lived after I took care of her for 4 hours until an ambulance showed up, which is a whole story. She's still a piece of shit. But it was like 9 a.m., not the way I wanted to start my day. I work security at a hospital. I really just sit outside of the construction zone where they're doing remodeling and make sure homeless people and teenagers don't get in. But I'm also sat right outside the door they used to take the bodies out. There's just something eerie about how, discreet and impersonal it is. Not that I expect there to be some sort of fanfare when someone dies, but they're just wrapped in quilts or thick blankets, quietly loaded up into an unmarked van, and that's it. It's a major hospital, so there's several bodies wheeled out every day. Worst is when you know it's a child, but I thankfully don't see much of that. They tend to wait until the middle of the night so less people see, so they don't upset people. Always just strikes this weird feeling in me when I see them. We used to take an old back road that would take us to town where I lived a while ago. It was a 20 to 30 minute drive. It was an old stretch of road that was an old worn road that went through a stretch of trees, a small burst of houses surrounded by farmland and fields, so it was a very rural area. There's a train track that cuts through, and an unkept road that goes off to the side on the right. One evening we went down the road. There was a car, I want to say an old Honda, I couldn't tell, that was parked off of that little road to the side. I saw them and thought odd, because the road leads to nowhere, it just stopped a few feet away. We came back much later in the day, night had fallen and the car was still sat there. A few days later, we find that the car had been linked to a murder. Apparently the car belonged to a woman who had been missing. Her boyfriend beat her and left her in a shallow grave. The car he abandoned and left there while her child was at school. Her name was Naisha Nelson. I was sitting outside having coffee, journaling in a tucked-away spot downtown. Some junkie decided to join near me and proceeded to lift up my pant leg and itch what was essentially his bone. His leg was in total decay. Most of his shin had been rotting away. I looked at him and asked if he wanted me to call an ambulance or get him some care. He met my eyes, kind of groaned, and just stared and itched. I got freaked out and just left. I was like 15. I was a few blocks away from a hospital and clinics, so I figured he wasn't too far from help if he chose it. When I was about 8 years old, I was walking down a sidewalk in Toronto when 3 young long-haired guys in their late teens or early 20s ran past us laughing and fooling around. I didn't think of it at the time, being a child, but it appeared they might have been drunk. Just after they passed by, I hear a loud screeching of brakes and a thud. I turned to see one of the men sliding down the road on his face. He flew about 20 yards before hitting the ground. A Harley rider almost ran over him and crashed his bike, avoiding the man. They approached him. He wasn't moving at all. The Harley rider took one quick look at him and took off his t-shirt and covered his head. From whatever he saw, he could clearly see the man was gone. His 2 other friends were just staring in stunned shock, not saying a word. It was 1970. Yeah, this kind of thing sticks with you. Late 70s, I was in about 3rd grade. Myself and 2 buddies were walking toward the crosswalk, having just gotten out of school. A car came out of nowhere and plowed through the crosswalk. There were 2 crossing guards and at least 2 other kids on the crosswalk. The 2 kids that I remember were girls, a year younger than me. I knew one. The crossing guards made it out okay, and the girl I knew got thrown to the side, ended up thumping the back of her head on the curb. A little blood from that, but she was otherwise okay and conscious. The other girl? Wow. I mean, this happened right in front of the 3 of us, about 15 feet away. I remember seeing the other girl lying face down in a big puddle of her own blood. The car had knocked off her shoes and her skirt, not the underwear at least. She looked like she had, slid for a short distance on her face when she made contact with the pavement, and then she came around. I'll never forget that. Couldn't make out her face for the blood, couldn't even tell how bad it was because there was so much blood. She was sobbing and calling out for her mommy. You could tell she was scared and didn't really know what had happened to her. The car never stopped, just kept on going after blowing through a school zone and an occupied crosswalk at about 40 miles an hour. An adult arrived with the ambulance and the police, probably a detective, asked the 3 of us what we saw. We walked to our respective homes afterwards, talking about the whole thing excitedly. Being a latchkey kid, I came home to an empty house, called my mom at work to tell her what had just happened and just broke. Completely fell to pieces on the phone as the reality hit me. I've never forgotten that incident or the girls, the images, their voices. Still see it clear as day. But I haven't talked about it in decades. On the bright side, the girls recovered. Good. One with just a bump on the back of her head, the other in the hospital. Our principal went to visit her there, brought her the cards we all made in class. Reported back to us on her condition, but I never knew her name. and I don't remember ever seeing her after that day. They caught up with the driver a few miles down the road. He was drunk. Well, I am relieved that this story had a happy ending because it's difficult to be a parent and start to read a story and you're assuming the worst, and I don't know, it's hard not to try to put your child in that position, and it got to me quick, but I'm glad that the girls recovered. A guy drove up next to me as I was taking a walk around my neighborhood, and asked for directions. The road he named was the next road down, and I told him so. What made it creepy was that the next words out of his mouth were a request to get in his truck and guide him. I was a 15-year-old, but I'm a stick of a person even now. I knew if this guy decided to stop and grab me, I had no chance of getting away. So I did what anyone would probably do. I told him no, and because I was on a section of sidewalk directly behind my house, cut through the backyard and booked it inside. I locked every door I could and called my dad to find out if he was working out that day, and asked him to skip if he could. My poor father came home and immediately showed me where the emergency release is in his trunk and how to find the button to turn off brake lights. I'd heard the "don't go into a stranger's car" line so often growing up, I honestly thought it was another myth to scare kids into not wandering around. It's up there with a bear encounter as one of the scariest things I've experienced. Many years ago, I saw a bush behind another bush while walking in my neighborhood, except it wasn't a bush, and it was peeking out from around a corner. It was moving, then it was gone. It wasn't unlike that scene in Halloween where Laurie sees Michael Myers and he hides behind a bush and sneaks away. It was something my brain could not interpret, but chose to see as a bush. I was around 11 or 12, middle of the day, wide awake, not under the influence of any drugs. It was weird and scary, and comes to me as deja vu sometimes. I went on a school field trip as a teacher to the Bahamas. We took 16 students to the island and kayaked all over the place. At some point, our guides took us into open water and had us basically kayak between islands, these long distances apart. Not only was there a long sequence where the water was extremely choppy, but at some point it was decided I had to be the adult in the back of the party to watch all the students as they kayaked. I was by myself in a 2-person sea kayak behind all these other people, and for whatever reason, my foot slipped off the rudder. I could not get it back on easily. The kayak was a little short for me, and I was spraining my ankle trying to just bend my leg in this small cramped space to get that foot back on the pedal. And while I'm doing this, my kayak was being pushed and turned by the waves. As I watched almost everyone paddling further and further away into the distance, I yelled. But the closest people to me were the youngest students, and none of them heard. Watching them just going further and further as the sun started setting in the distance was the effing scariest moment of my life. Yes, I survived, but I still have nightmares about that moment that have never felt comfortable around open water since. Living in Kenya, my wife, there was a nurse, single mom who lived next door to our apartment who we casually was friendly with us. One day, during her work shift, the 10-year-old boy, who was kind of short-stacked, 2 glass top-end tables on top of each other to climb and reach the top of the closet. He climbed on top, and the glass gave out completely, slicing his clad from bottom to top. It was literally just hanging by a small flap of muscle, just flapping. Somehow the boy gathered himself and hobbled over to our front door and knocked and rang. Meanwhile, coating the entire hallway in about a 1/4 inch of blood. That's when I opened the door to see what I quickly thought was a dying boy in front of me with a severed artery. I grabbed him into my arms and called the house girl and wife for a scarf, and I immediately began triage and applying a tourniquet. In a Western country, this is where you call 911 or an ambulance. In Kenya, we fortunately knew a local taxi driver who had a station wagon. My wife managed to call the mom as we drove, and her work hospital was the closest to us, so she met us there. I was in the back of the station wagon holding the tourniquet and praying he didn't die on me. The look on the face of the mom when we got there? All's well though. The boy had emergency surgery to repair his muscle and only had a slight limp as a result in a few months. I was 12 and walking to my grandparents' house carrying my pet to drop it off before going on vacation. My grandparents' house was 2 doors down from my own. While I was walking, a random car pulled up next to me, and the man rolled down his window. He said, "Do you have a dog? I just saw a dog walking down the street, and it might be yours. You want to come try and pick it up with me?" I was 12, but not an idiot. I'm a woman. My mother taught me better than that. I stayed far away from the car, said no. He insisted I stayed, but I fled, and quickly walked to my grandparents' house. I told my family the story. They called the police, and little 12-year-old me had to talk to the police over the phone on my way to the airport. I described him, his car, everything I could remember. Turns out the man was wanted for burglary and attempted kidnapping. I count myself lucky. The creepy thing is, this happened basically right outside my home, in my safe neighborhood, when coincidentally, no one else was around. Never saw him again.